Excuse me, are you the defendant in this case?
No, I am a student attorney representing a client.
She was dressed professionally. She was carrying binders. She was second in line. Every single attorney ahead of her walked straight through that courtroom door with no questions, no stops, no problem. Then she stepped forward, and a white sheriff's deputy physically put his body between her and that door. He looked her over, and then he said the words that would travel around the entire world. "Are you sure you're in the right courtroom? Are you the defendant?" She was not the defendant. She was the attorney. This is the real, documented, verified story of Brooklyn Crockton, a 25-year-old black law student from Rochester, New York, who walked into a Rhode Island courthouse on March 3rd, 2022, to do her job, and was stopped by a deputy who had already decided, before she said a single word, exactly who and what she was. What happened next and what Brooklyn did about it shook the legal world, made national headlines, and started a conversation that is still happening today. Before we dive deeper into this absolutely shocking story, hit that subscribe button if you believe in holding authority figures accountable when they abuse their power. Before we get to that courthouse door, you need to understand who Brooklyn Crockton is, because this story only hits as hard as it does when you know where she started. Brooklyn grew up in Rochester, New York. She was the first person in her immediate family to go to college. Not the first to go to law school, the first to go to college. Period. She carried that weight everywhere she went, through every exam, every late night, every moment of doubt. In 5th grade, she did something that tells you everything about the kind of person she is. She wrote herself a note, wrapped it around a gavel-shaped pencil, and sealed it away. When she opened it in high school, it said, "My dream is to be a judge." Not a lawyer, a judge. That little girl from Rochester had the whole picture already in her mind. And by 2022, she was 3 months away from making it real. But first, she had to survive a morning that would try to take everything she had built right at the courthouse door. Brooklyn was a third-year student at Roger Williams University School of Law in Bristol, Rhode Island. In her final year, she was enrolled in the Criminal Defense Clinic, a supervised program under Rhode Island Supreme Court Rule 9 that allows advanced law students to represent real clients in real court, not mock trials, not simulations, actual people with actual cases whose futures depend on the quality of their representation. Brooklyn had a client that morning, a real person with a real misdemeanor case at the Garrahy Judicial Complex in Providence. She had prepared. She had her binders. She had her folders. She had reviewed every detail of the case. She arrived early, stood in line with the other attorneys, and waited for the courtroom doors to open. She was ready. She was professional. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. And that is precisely when everything went wrong. The line outside the courtroom moved the way courthouse lines always move, slowly, with the quiet shuffle of attorneys checking their phones and adjusting their files. Brooklyn was second in line, right there near the front. When the deputy came out to let attorneys in, he did what security personnel do. He opened the door and began allowing people through. One attorney walked in, then another, then another. Each one passed without pause, without a question, without a second glance. Then Brooklyn stepped forward, and the deputy moved, not a side forward. He placed his body directly between her and the door, a human barrier. He asked her to step to the side. She stepped aside. The remaining attorneys entered the courtroom, all of them, without a word. And what he said to her next alone in that hallway is what broke the internet. He asked for her name. She gave it. He looked at his docket sheet. He told her. He didn't see her name on it. Then he asked a question, the one that would eventually be read by millions of people across the world. "Are you sure you're in the right courtroom? Are you the defendant?" Brooklyn Crockton stood in that courthouse hallway in her professional clothes, with her binder stacked in her arms, and absorbed those words. She told him she was a student attorney there to represent a client. He let her in. He said, "Hey, sorry." She told her audience later. There was no ounce of emotion in that sorry. But she walked into that courtroom. She sat down. She did her job. What nobody knew yet was that it wasn't over. The deputy was about to make things significantly worse. If the deputy had stopped after that hollow apology, this story might have stayed inside the walls of that courtroom. But he didn't stop. Multiple times during the hearing, he approached Brooklyn to explain courtroom procedure to her. He pointed out where the judge sits. He told her where she should sit. He told her that when the judge speaks to her, she is to stand and address him properly. He explained how court works to a third-year law student who had been studying law for 3 years and was in that exact room to practice it. Brooklyn described the feeling precisely. I'm getting pretty weirded out and very anxious because every time he comes up to me, he is saying something very patronizing, and I want this experience to be done. She kept her composure. She stayed focused on her client. She got through the hearing. But the moment that changed everything came right after when her supervising professor walked in. After the hearing, Brooklyn met up with her supervising attorney, Professor Andrew Horwitz, Assistant Dean for Experiential Education at Roger Williams University Law. The deputy, who had spent the entire morning inserting himself into Brooklyn's experience, walked over. He spoke to Professor Horwitz directly. He explained the situation. He talked through the morning's events. And in doing so, he revealed something even more painful than what had already happened. According to Brooklyn, the deputy literally does not even look at me, does not even address me. She was standing right there. She was the one it had happened to. She was the attorney, the student, the person at the center of every word being spoken, and she was treated as if she were invisible. Professor Horwitz heard what happened, and his response set the next chain of events in motion. A few hours later, Brooklyn sat in a lounge at RW Law's Providence campus. She was still processing. Her hands were probably still shaking a little. She picked up her phone not to call a lawyer, not to file a complaint, but to do what 25-year-olds in 2022 do when something happens to them that the world needs to hear. She pressed the record. She spoke directly into the camera from the lounge, in her own words, with no script and no editing. She said, I have never been so embarrassed in my entire life. Like I felt like crying at that moment. She said, you hear stories like this all the time with black attorneys, but when it happens to you, it is so visceral you don't even know what to say. Then she said something quietly devastating. Why would you assume that I'm a defendant? I think we all know why. She posted it. She had 400 followers. By the next morning, the number that mattered was not 400. Within hours, the TikTok had taken off. By the time major news organizations found it, the video had over 341,000 views and more than 3,000 comments from people in Texas, from people in the United Kingdom, from black attorneys and doctors and professors and engineers all across the world flooding into her comment section with the same message. This happened to me too. A black attorney in Georgia described being escorted out of a client meeting. A black doctor in London wrote about being handed a patient gown when she arrived in her own hospital. The video had unlocked something, a door that thousands of people had been quietly pressing against for years, never quite sure anyone would open it. But what happened when the big media outlets picked up the story genuinely surprised Brooklyn, and the Rhode Island legal establishment was about to be put on notice. Brooklyn Crockton went from 400 TikTok followers to a national news story in under 48 hours. Good Morning America ran the story. The Boston Globe published a full interview. The Providence Journal covered it. Essence magazine covered it. Outlets from across the country reached out. Suddenly, a morning that Brooklyn had tried to simply survive became the center of a nationwide conversation about race, assumption, and who gets to belong in a courthouse. Roger Williams University School of Law released a statement saying it was grateful and proud that Brooklyn had shared her story. They confirmed they had reached out immediately to the state judiciary and sheriff's office after learning of the incident. But what the Rhode Island judiciary said publicly was going to matter enormously, and their statement was deeply revealing. The Rhode Island judiciary released a formal statement to Good Morning America. They confirmed that the state court administrator had personally been in touch with the chief of the division of sheriffs. They acknowledged that both the judiciary and the sheriffs require implicit bias training for their staff. And then came the part that caught everyone's attention. They called the encounter an opportunity to talk about and challenge the assumptions we make about the people that come through our courthouses every day. An opportunity not an aberration, not a shocking surprise, an opportunity because they knew, in choosing that word carefully, that this was a known, ongoing problem that required deliberate, ongoing work. Meanwhile, the chief sheriff had not returned a single phone call, and that silence was speaking volumes. One detail from Brooklyn's Boston Globe interview cut deeper than almost anything else. She revealed that being the first in her family to go to college meant she sometimes struggled with imposter syndrome, that quiet internal voice that whispers you don't really belong here. She was already carrying that weight every single day she walked into a law school classroom. And then, on a Thursday morning in March, a deputy sheriff in a courthouse confirmed that voice. He made her imposter syndrome external. He made it official. He made it real in front of a room full of attorneys who watched him pull her out of line and let everyone else through. Brooklyn said it plainly. That is why my confidence took a hit when I was pulled out of line like that. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't failed any test. She had simply walked forward and been stopped. But what emerged from the wreckage of that morning was something that nobody expected from a first-generation student who almost cried in a courthouse hallway. Here is a twist that defines Brooklyn Crockton's character more than anything else in this story. When reporters pressed her on the deputy on accountability, on consequences, on what should happen to him, she said something that stopped people cold. She said she did not want the incident to negatively impact the deputy or his family. She said what she wanted was simply a time when you see a person of color walking to the courthouse and you don't assume they're a defendant, and even if they are, you treat them with respect. She never named the deputy publicly. She never called for his firing. She protected a man who had publicly humiliated her because she understood that the problem was never about one man. It was about a system that had been producing men like him, unchallenged for decades. Professor Andrew Horwitz, the man the deputy had addressed instead of Brooklyn, did not stay quiet. He gave interviews. He said, "What it shows is that implicit bias is a very serious problem in this country. It's very hard to find a single attorney of color who has not had the experience of being confused for a defendant or litigant." He did not soften it. He did not hedge. He had watched it happen to his student in real time, and he said out loud what many legal professionals have been whispering for years. The legal profession, he noted, still operates with a deeply embedded picture one attorney is supposed to look like, and that picture is still, far too often, not a young black woman with binders in her arms. And behind the scenes at Roger Williams, something was already changing because of Brooklyn's video. Roger Williams University School of Law did not treat Brooklyn's experience as an isolated incident or a one-time PR problem. The law school engaged directly with the Rhode Island Judiciary and Bar Association to address implicit bias in court settings. They introduced a required new course on race and American law. They began working with alumni, practicing attorneys, and the state judiciary to create what the school's dean described as a less biased and more equitable justice system. Brooklyn's story had not just gone viral, it had become a catalyst inside the institution she had trusted with her future. The school's dean said clearly, the only way to counter implicit bias effectively is through training making that implicit bias explicitly understood so you can take specific steps to counter it. But the biggest institutional shift triggered by Brooklyn's video was still coming, and it stretched far beyond Rhode Island. Researchers and civil rights organizations began documenting the comment section of Brooklyn's video as evidence of a national pattern. Over 3,000 people had shared their own experiences, and the geographic range was staggering. United Kingdom, Texas, California, Georgia, Canada, Australia, black professionals across every field, law, medicine, academia, finance, describing the same experience in different buildings in different countries. Being stopped, being questioned, being made to prove they belonged in a room they had every right to be in. The American Bar Association had already reported that over half of women of color in law had been mistaken for non-attorneys. Brooklyn's video put a human face on that statistic. It made the data impossible to dismiss. And then came the moment that told you everything about how this story was going to end for Brooklyn personally. Brooklyn admitted something vulnerable and real in her interviews. She worried that going viral might hurt her career before it started. She was a law student about to enter the job market. Would firms see her as a troublemaker, a liability, Would the attention follow her into interviews and close doors before she could open them? It was a legitimate fear, one that Black professionals navigating predominantly white institutions understand intimately. The calculation of speaking up versus staying quiet. The math of visibility versus survival. Brooklyn had spoken. She had been seen. And now she waited to find out what it would cost her. What actually happened the day before she graduated should be told in every law school in the country. The day before Brooklyn Crockton graduated from Roger Williams University School of Law, she received a job offer, a tax litigation position with a law firm in Houston, Texas. She accepted. And here's the part that mattered most. During the entire interview process for that job, her viral TikTok never came up once. Not once. The thing she had feared would define her negatively had not cost her a single professional opportunity. What it had done was make her name known. What it had done was let the legal community see exactly who she was: composed, principled, courageous, and determined. And it turned out the legal community liked what it saw. But Brooklyn wasn't done, because she had one more move to make, and it pointed straight back to that fifth grade note. After graduating and starting her career, Brooklyn remained active with the National Black Law Students Association. The organization, partly energized by stories like hers, began building a formal anonymous reporting system, a mechanism that would allow interns, students, paralegals, and attorneys who experience racial bias to report incidents and initiate a real sanctioning process. Not a comment section, not a viral video, a structured, institutional accountability tool. Brooklyn's experience had been powerful enough to generate national headlines. But headlines fade. Systems endure. She understood that her story was most useful not as a moment, but as a building block for something permanent. And what she said about the future told you exactly where the story and Brooklyn herself was always headed. Brooklyn Crockton still wants to be a judge. The girl who wrapped that note around a gavel-shaped pencil in fifth grade has not changed her destination. She went through law school as the first in her family to go to college. She walked into a courthouse to defend someone who couldn't defend themselves. She was stopped at the door and told without words, but with absolute clarity, that she did not belong. And she did not collapse. She did not quit. She posted a video, told the truth, protected a man who humiliated her, graduated with a job offer, and kept building toward the bench. She said herself, "The legal profession is not one that has any room for biases, especially the implicit racial ones." When Brooklyn Crockton becomes a judge, every person who ever stood at a courthouse door wondering if they belong will have someone on the other side of it who knows exactly what that moment feels like. That deputy thought he was stopping a defendant. He was actually standing in front of a future judge. And he stepped aside anyway. Just not fast enough. This story is real. Brooklyn Crockton is real. The binders were real. The humiliation was real. And the resilience, that quiet, unbreakable determination to keep walking through every door that tries to stop you, is more real than anything else in this story. If this moved you, share it. Because somewhere right now, another Brooklyn is standing in another line, and the world needs to know her name before the door closes. Subscribe to Rawlins Justice, because the truth is always worth telling, even when the system doesn't want to hear it.